want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflex here, back with a new Shadowverse 2 video. For today's video, I want to go over pretty briefly every craft's bronze, silvers, golds, legendaries, and talk a bit about them in the context of Take 2. Now, I'm not the best Take 2 player, and so this video will be kind of a learning exercise for myself if anyone wants to correct me on the things I say. But as the set gets older, I think a lot more people will be looking to play Take 2. And while Take 2 is pretty expensive, and I'm still not very happy with how nerfed the rewards are for going to 4 and 5 wins, it is still something that we can do as opposed to playing ladder when we're really bored with the game. And if you play only one Take 2 session like every 3 to 4 days, then you're technically going even if you go just like 0-2, because you're gaining the 1,000 gold that you need to pay for a ticket through those like 3-4 days of dailies. So even though it's still really expensive, and even though technically you're better off saving for the next set if you just want to like accumulate resources and you're not good at the game, Take 2 is still a different game mode and there's still different vibes. And even though you get unlucky and crushed by somebody with a perfect legendary curve, sometimes you just want to play something that's not constructed and you still want to play Shadowverse 2. So getting into the video, I ranked these loosely into what I think is the best class to worst crafts in Take 2. Obviously, Dragon's going to be first, and then Force is probably going to be last. And again, if you disagree with what I say, feel free to tell me in the comments, because I'm also still learning Take 2 to become more than competent at it, hopefully. Going with Dragon first, we can go ahead and skip through the bronzes. Basically, the way I've done this is that I've put the bronzes I think are good above, and then everything else at the bottom. I don't think we can say... Yeah, we can't really check to see what is inside the deck and what isn't. So I'll just like click through really quickly just so you can see what I haven't put up there in case you're curious about what cards I deem not as good. But basically the reason why I think Dragon is kind of absurd in Take 2 is because they have probably the best selection out of the bronzes and silvers out of every craft in the game. If you look at the top, all of these cards are either technically mana efficient for what they do, or they give you some pretty good value in the long run. Value-wise, Ivory Dragon, Fledgling Dragon Slayer, these are both very good high-value cards. Strike of Dragon Newt, Searing Fire Newt, like Dragon Any, Devoted Disdain, Call of Megalorca, Raging Lightning. These are all technically cards that are a little decent for their mana cost. And then Silverclaw Dragon Rider just represents a card that can end games really easily because of the fact that usually in Take 2, people don't have as many resources to deal with intimidated keyword cards like Vastwing Dragon. And then if we go over to the silvers, we can see that a lot of the silvers that Dragon has that are really high quality, even in constructed, are obviously silver in Take 2. So stuff like Ocean Rider, Dragon Sign, and Seasoned Merman, these are all cards that are insanely good in Take 2 or in constructed. So obviously that carries over into Take 2. And there are not very many classes that have cards as powerful as Seasoned Merman and Ocean Rider in their silver rarity. And then obviously Dragon still has cards like Pyreworm Blade, Supplicant of Disdain, Draconic Berserker that represent cards that are pretty mediocre, but still far above the power level of cards that a lot of other classes can enjoy. Pyreworm Blade being a good mana sink is always going to be really efficient, especially in certain scenarios where you could not clear minions due to lacking one attack otherwise. Supplicant of Disdain is just a good, like, in between. Like, for example, sometimes you play a turn 5 play and you have to evo something really meh to kill something small, like for example like a 2/2 that's left on board. Supplicant of Disdain lets you not have to burn an evo and also heal if you're behind on tempo. And then Dragon Note Melody is just drawing. I think Dragon Note Melody and Intent Dragon Note Princess are probably the weakest cards I have up here, but if you look at the cards below, I think the only ones that could theoretically come close would be like Marion or Battleforged Dragonkeeper. But the reason why I didn't put Marion up there is because Marion requires you to have like other minions on board earlier, and then Battleforged Dragonkeeper, in my opinion, is just a worse version of the bronze card we saw earlier, because it's easier to clear this card than it is to clear the one that summons a dragon after it dies to a board wipe. And then obviously we do have the Dragoncraft golds and legendaries. In terms of gold, I think Dragoncraft, the main really important one is Neptune. Neptune is almost legendary quality, and the fact that she's down at gold is really powerful. And obviously we have Twilight Dragon as just like the generic board wipe. That's really good. I think all the other cards that exist for Dragon aren't that great. Like Genesis Dragon Reborn is a good closer, but you're not really happy to see it. Liu Fang is like something that you're even struggling to really want to play in constructed, but she's fine to snowball in Take 2, and sometimes you snowball to a win. And these other cards like Kong of Disdain is like a very mediocre board wipe and is just fine. And Ferocious Flame can be a cycle later on. And then obviously we have the legendaries. Forte can just straight up win you games because you just evo her and go to face. And again, Intimidate, not everyone has an Intimidate factor or board clear. Yaryu is extremely powerful because Take Two is usually a much more tempo-based deck. So if you see either of these or both of these cards available in your I guess like immediate pick, then Dragon is probably always a must click. Yao and Azure Ifrit are both also pretty good. I think Azure Ifrit is just a little slow, and sometimes you don't have the Super Evo for him. And at that point, he's just a more expensive version of the Congregant of Disdain, which is again a very mediocre but alright play. And Azure Ifrit can also win you games pretty consistently because they can't kill him if you run them out of Evo resources. So almost every single Dragon Legendary is fine. Like Burnite is fine because she does a board clear, but obviously losing a card for it does kind of feel bad. With all that said, we can move on to the next craft. I'm trying to keep these a little shorter because I think the last take I did, the Dragon section was on like 7 minutes. So I'm like, okay, gotta redo that to make sure we're going a bit more brief. I think Rune would not be up here if it wasn't for the fact that side games felt like they deserved to have more rerolls than the other classes for some reason. And so for bronzes, we can see that the Rune list is a lot shorter than the Dragon list. They have a lot of mediocre 2-drops. So for example, in the Dragon list, we had 2-drops that also quote unquote did nothing, but they at least had a really good upside. For Rune, they do have some good cycle cards like Melvi, Arcane, Archivist, and Apprentice Astrologer. These are all decent like 2-drops, so that's why they're up here. But stuff like Devotee of Truth and Truth Summons, they're very, very mediocre. And then Dazzling Rune Knight, Owl Summoner, like these are all right. Like Owl Summoner, for example, is really good if you have Earthright cards like packaged in with the rest of your deck. But if you get Owl Summoner early, or if you get it late and you have no Earthright cards, then you can see why I have this as mediocre. But honestly, it could go up here as well. And then everything else is like all right. I think Crystal Gazing is probably something you can click pretty often, but everything else is either very, very low tempo. For example, Starry-Eyed Penguin Wizard, or it's just something that you probably wouldn't want to evo anyways because you're probably only drafting Rune if you got some excellent legendaries on the click, or you're just gonna ego the fact you have a billion rerolls. And then in silvers, I think Rune does have it worse here. Once again, like the 2-drop Miss Miranda isn't that great if you don't already have other spell boost things drafted. And then Sage Light Teachings is fine, but again, you need Earthlight Sigils for this. Flames of Chaos needs spell boost. It's very conditional, but again, with all these rerolls, you can probably put it together. Going on the top, just because you're probably more interested in what these are like, Instant of Truth is just very, very good because it's like a 3 mana. It's like a better version of the Crown from Swordcraft, in my opinion, because it's both cheaper and it doesn't clutter your board. So if you want to go for wide boards, it's there. And again, it's just a very good mana sink because sometimes you have a curved plan, so you're gonna use Institute of Truth to buff up cards that would otherwise be maybe mediocre, and it makes them way better by giving them extra stats, and also get some card draw when you play those buffs minions. And then Remy and Rani is a card that's really whatever in Constructed, but in Take Two, she has the potential to be really insane because when you Super Evo Remy and Rani, what happens is that she generates an extra 8/8 in stats because when you play her, you get the 3/3. So just generically, she is a 7/7 with Earthright. But once you Super Evo, the Golem gains an extra 8/8. Or no, my bad, an extra 5/5 because you gain the Evo stats, which is +2/+2, and an additional 3/3. So this is an 8/8 Golem along with a 7/7 Remy and Rani, and they both have Rush. So Remy and Rani can be super, super efficient if you have the Earthright available, which shouldn't be too hard because Earthright, again, is pretty common in the bronze offerings. Then Chanting Perfumer is a pretty decent 4-drop, and Burgent is just a really powerful 5-drop with permanent value, especially in Take Two. Runecraft Golds are also, I probably should have just put these up here if we're being honest, but they aren't that amazing. Like Penelope, Super Evo is like very good coping wise, and Edelweiss is also very, very strong for tempo. But these all, again, require you to have some sort of like backup or like generator before you draft them, or you're going to be looking to draft those generators as you click, which is once again pretty common because of the fact that you have infinite rerolls with Rune. And then obviously with legendaries, you have a whole slew of things you're more than happy to find. Anangrea, super strong. Norman, super strong. Kuwan, super strong. The Lantham, way better in Take Two than she is in generic gameplay. Even Ryo can be good if you have a lot of draw in Take Two because he comes with a board wipe, so you just dropped a few more spells to help him get the board wipe. And then Declimb, if you somehow make Declimb work, then you'll just win even harder in Take Two than you would in Constructed. Going into the next craft I think is good. I'm not too sure about these next few crafts. I think Forest is definitely not that great because they only have 2 rerolls still. But from Portal, Sword, Haven, and Abyss. I think these could honestly go in any way. I think maybe I think Portal and Sword do have slightly better quality bronze and silvers though, which is why they rank a bit above Abyss and Haven. But I think Abyss and Haven do have some pretty good cards despite that. So for Portal, this is the one that again I'm not as certain about, but I think they do have some pretty good bronzes. I don't really like the artifact bronzes because with artifact bronze cards, you really need to go heavy on the artifacts. So if you draft a few artifact cards early and then you see barely any going forward, you'll have a bunch of dead cards that barely do anything in your deck. So you do have to be lucky, in my opinion, with the artifact selection. You can just ego it and go like ham and just pray and you might be rewarded. But for the most part, the cards that I think are better with artifacts are going to be the ones that are either very good like bodies. So for example, Iron Hunter is a good start for artifact because she's a good body and she gives you the fanfare and a good evo. But stuff like Puppeteer or Puppet Lancer is probably a better bronze because he gives you a archetype agnostic battle cry, which allows you to fight for a board a lot more cheaply than what you could otherwise do. Same thing with Wired Assault. Bolt from Beyond can also go up here if you have more artifact cards, but I think Wild Assault is just more efficient again. And then Engine Blade Maven and Supersonic Fighter are just very good tempo plays that are, once again, pretty bad in the actual game, but in Take-Two, tempo plays are way more valuable. And Engine Blade Maven, obviously, summoning a bunch of 5/1 rushes along with her own Evo is really good. And Supersonic Fighter, just giving you a whole board wipe pretty cheaply, is nice as well. The silvers are going to be more of the same story where I think that there's some good high value silvers with the more generic offerings. Wasteland Destruction might be a bit scary to play, but I think that because, like for example, you get Puppet Lancer, you trade the Puppet Lancer's puppet into something, that enhanced puppet is going away anyways, so Wasteland Destruction can be pretty good. And if you get to pick a Wasteland Destruction, that means that you can start picking other things like Subcam Destruction or other destruction cards to help you out to break that for an extra draw. And then Atrim can very often just win you games with like if your opponent evos a 2/2 minion, you just Atrim it, and then suddenly they can't do anything because you clear their board and they have nothing to respond to you with. And then Noah is just Noah. Noah is just very good. I think there are a bunch of mediocre cards that you could play, like Mega Cavalier, you could argue for. Field Scientist, you could probably argue for. But everything else feels like a card that you need to have an archetype around. And sometimes as a Portal player, like with 3 different archetypes that all do somewhat different things, I think it's a little hard, but it's probably more likely to hit than with other crafts that exist, like with Forest and like with Haven and Abyss. Now for golds, I think it's once again a matter of how confident you are in your draft. So like stuff like Devastating Soprano, Sylvia, Soprano, Synchronous Hearts, and Liam, those are all cards that seem very okay to draft in no matter what type of Portal deck you have. But the artifact ones, like Conquer of Destruction, is technically anti-tempo. Outlet isn't really great unless you have a few other artifact cards played beforehand. Carnelia is nigh useless if you don't have artifacts or Evo. Like she's just another generic 2/2, but her Evo effect doesn't even help you clear like the bronze card does. I think if you have a strong start with your initial pick, like you start with Outlet and you have Ralmia on your like first 2 cards, then you could probably pick Portal and lean into artifacts if you're lucky enough to get them. Obviously for legendaries, UD is like very whatever as a legendary in my opinion. She's only okay in constructed because you don't really care about their rarity at that point, but in Take-Two you do. I think for Take-Two you'd almost always prefer to see Orcus, Ralmia, and Karula. And Zwei is like, I feel like Zwei is just a worse Synchronous Hearts in terms of rarity, and if like because you'd rather see like one of these 3. Or like you'd rather see Orcus, Infinite Orcus, right? And you'd rather see Lashena than Zwei. But Zwei isn't terrible. She's definitely playable. And so you're probably not that unhappy, but it could again just be Synchronous Hearts instead on a lower rarity pick. So Portal does have some very good legendaries like Ralmia, conditionally insane. Orcus always gonna be strong. Lashena is probably alright because she comes with Melodious Monody. Everything else, Karula again, is fine if you have the support for it, but in constructed, Karula is more like a second outlet. But in Take-Two, he's taking a legendary slot. So there's a lot of like things you'd rather not see, like UD and Axia. But the other 4, or the other 5 rather, are okay if you get lucky. Or 2 out of the other 5 are okay if you get lucky, and the other 3, no, my bad. These 3 are fine. Like you'd rather see these 2, I think. Unless you have artifact support, then Ralmia is okay. And then that's just like a skill diff and your own judgment. Going forward, we have Sword. Now I think I have Sword a bit low just because after playing Sword a lot on Take Two, I've realized that it's not as powerful as I think it originally was. I do think Sword is still pretty good, especially as a new Take Two beginner, but from playing it myself and losing a lot with it, I've realized that it's probably not as insane as I initially thought from set 2. So in the bronzes, we do have some good cards. You might be surprised to see that Flashlight Quickblader and Saria are not in the selection. And that's mainly because Saria is really good and constructed because you can force the synergy with Rose, but in Take Two, once again, it's up to your discretion and your skill and draft to get Saria and Rose at the same time. And then Flashlight Quickblader is really good in these aggro decks because you're trying to rush your opponent down, but you can't predict the fact that you're going to be able to draft an Albert, you're going to be able to draft Tentacles, you're going to be able to draft all the Storm cards you would otherwise have for aggro Swordcraft to be good. And then things like Wave the Maid and Lucrative Deal are fine, but I feel like the things I have up here are actually like great tempo and value cards. Samurai doesn't need much explanation. I think all the loot cards are just borderline really good. Hound of War, obviously Dogs is great, Execute is great, and Kagemitsu Light is very efficient if you can get him down because he does just act as a thing that your opponent must clear or else they take a lot of damage or you have to trade super efficiently. And then everything else is like pretty conditional. Like Centurion, it's good if you can get to the point where you can whack your opponent really hard, but that again requires you to get lucky, in my opinion, of like how your deck is drafted. And for the silvers, we see that once again I do have a pretty short list of things I think that are actually genuinely good for Sword. When it comes to silvers, Royal Coachwoman and Luminous Lance Trooper are just very good 2-drops. Supplicant, again, is just a good loot card. But these other 2 cards, while they are fine and great, they aren't, like, Luminous Magus is obviously very strong, but when you play against, like, for me, in my experience, when I play Luminous Magus against certain high roll decks, she feels not useless, but obviously against the people that aren't as lucky as those people, she feels very, very good. And then Gelt is just decent as a later game play because what happens a lot is that you do super evo somebody and he ends up buffing a very large board because the thing you buffed probably came with a lot of spawn minions like Luminous Magus or Luminous Land Trooper or Draconia or something like Amalia or whatever you have later on. Shinobi Squirrel is fine, but I'll be honest, like that thing rarely wins me games. Band of the Battle Princess is probably honestly good enough to be put up here, but I don't think Sword has as many great silvers as I initially thought from last set. Now for the gold, Sword, honestly Zirconia and Geno are like the huge big winners. Vals 2 is very efficient. Rose I feel like falls off the less of the Sarias you have. But otherwise, obviously Malia and Rounding Tentacles, like these are like Sword has some really great quality gold minions. But the issue in Take 2 is that you get way more bronzes and silvers than you do the golds and legendaries. And that's why I think the power level of Sword can feel very wonky in Take 2 because you're chasing the golds. Whereas for Dragon, you're very often chasing the silvers, if that makes sense. And then for legendaries, obviously Melia is insane value, and Albert is really good at closing out games. But I feel like Kagemitsu is very mediocre, and Sincero is also like pretty whatever. Gildaria is still gonna be very broken in Take 2 for obvious reasons. So if you have stuff like Gildaria and Amelia as your first 2 picks, I think Sword is very safe to choose in your Take 2 games. Moving on, next we have Haven. So Haven is something that I tried drafting. So basically when I started playing Take 2 again this set, I drafted Haven thinking there was like 7 rerolls still, and there were not 7 rerolls, and then I got absolutely destroyed because I drafted a pretty bad deck. And I didn't realize how much the rerolls really added to Haven. So that's why I have it a bit lower. A lot of these latter half crafts, in my opinion, like again, it includes Sword. So I guess just as a brief tangent, like these top 3 decks, or these top 2 decks, I think, well, not really top 2. So Dragon specifically, you can almost never miss on draft. Rune is basically impossible because of all the extra rerolls you have. Portal, you can almost never go wrong just by drafting Puppet cards, and if you get really lucky, you can go into Artifact and get super insane value from Artifact high rolling. But these last 4 cards, or last 4 crafts, I feel as though are very reliant on getting lucky with their bronze and silver picks because their I guess like optimal selections are much smaller than what these 2 crafts have, and even what Portal has, because Portal can luck into having an artifact curve if you get lucky with the selection offerings. So we can see that kind of apparently it's very apparent with Haven, because you can see that the golds and silvers I think are good quality like barely fill the top row. And so for the bronzes, Havencraft bronzes, you have some pretty good 2-drops and low cost minions, but besides that, you really only have Serene Sanctuary, which is a very good card draw to be fair, and Blinding Faith, which is a very good AoE and very efficient card draw, which is really good in Take 2 because you're often low on cards from not having the ability to draft more card efficiently in Take 2. But like stuff like Damus and Devotee, these are, or Damus is just bad in general, but Devotee is only good in Cresthaven because of Marwyn. Luminous Sensor, like just healing is not that great. Holy Shield Maiden, Click of Crushing, these two cards seem like they're pretty hard balanced around having Wilbert. So if you have Wilbert, then it's good. But you probably, like, I guess you have to be very confident to click into Haven if there's no Wilbert available. Like, if there's Wilbert, then I think you just put these up here pretty easily. But without Wilbert, they don't really want to be clicked on. These Storm cards are fine, but you need to be able to draft like a good tempo deck to get the Storm cards. And then Winged Warrior, never seen anyone play this. Radiant Guiding Angel feels like it should be okay in Take 2, but it just honestly, like, if people aren't playing the Penguin, they don't really see why you're playing the Radiant Guiding Angel. And then Soulcure Sister is probably honestly alright, just because it really, I feel like in Take 2, it's really easy to punish people for overcommitting to a board and then wiping them, and then healing out of their attempt at lethal with stuff like Soulcure Sister. So I feel like she is okay, but she ends up requiring you to draft a lot of the good golds and legendaries to stabilize. And then moving on to the silvers, it's kind of more of the same, where the early minions, there's like alright early minions with Sarissa. Darkhaven Grace is like probably the card you want to draft for with Haven, just because it's so efficient for healing and buffing units over time, because again, floating mana is very common. Winged Dragon Statue is honestly just an absurdly efficient spell because you get the value of the 1-cost amulet and the 2-cost amulet in one. And it is, I guess, technically a bad tempo play because you can't really get the countdown out too quickly. But it's still like decent, I think, in the mid game. And then Immaculate Adjudicator is just a very strong like 1-for-1 card that can often be better than 1-for-1. And then a lot of the value for Havencraft does lie in their legendaries and golds. Like if you manage to craft Congregate Repose, it's like permanent card draw and a really good again 1-for-1. It's like very similar in stats with Immaculate Adjudicator, but you get an upside for evoing it. And then obviously Unholy Vessel is really powerful. Lapis can just win you games over time. But the rest of these goals, like you don't ever want to draft Manning Benison. Pact of the Princess Beast is like okay, but it's not like you don't feel it's not Lapis or Cup value, right? Stuff like Ronavero is also alright, but at that point, like very frequently, like it just feels like another Immaculate Adjudicator. And then Shining Disenchantments, again, only good with Cresthaven. Agnes requires you to have Amulets active, so it's a bit conditional. And Skullfane, I mean, it's Skullfane. You get lucky and you'll be fine, but get unlucky, he'll feel terrible. And then for the golds, like Salefa, if you get Wilbert, I think Haven's way, way more clickable. Getting Wilbert and Aether is like even more insane, but I feel like Marwyn is like very okay because you have to get lucky with the Crest clicks. I mean, getting Marwyn is probably good enough to click Haven just because you just want to get lucky with Marwyn, then you just click every crest and play Cresthaven in Arena. But Salefa is also very solid. But like stuff like Himeka, you can't really click her because she is, again, a Cresthaven locked unit. So there's a lot of things that just kind of aren't good with Haven, which is also sort of true for Portal, but I feel like Portal has a lot more tempo-oriented cards that will let you cheese some games out, even if you get unlucky with the draft. Abyss is a deck that I almost went 6-1 with this deck, or with this craft, and I only lost because I misplayed. So I think this is a card or a craft that can actually high roll, and now that I'm looking at what I have in the bronzes, it probably should be higher than the than Sword and Haven. I just think that when you miss as Abyss, it feels even worse. So in the 1-drops, once again, we have a lot of early curve minions, so with Abyss, you can just curve out your opponent and just kind of win through early tempo. The 1-drops, or the 1-drop rather, Cultivated Malice is always very good because of the ghost value. 2-2 at worst, Storm at best. Ghastly Sorcery is always going to be very absurdly efficient if you draw it on curve. Auril enables some very funny shenanigans with the bats, and then everything else is like a pretty decent value or tempo play if you manage to draw them. For the silvers, I think the silvers are about as good, if not better. Another 1-drop, Barrel can just win you games if you get tempo and your opponent doesn't. Winged Servants with Auril, very, very powerful. Cal 720 is just a more efficient version of Seraphic Tidings. Vuela is Vuela. Shadow Crypt Memorial lets you set up some pretty nasty lethals if you get Cerberus, for example, obviously. And then Silk of Entwining, Undead Soldier, and Vlad the Impaler, they're all just very strong tempo cards they can get. And then these other cards, like the reason why I think Abyss was rated lower to me initially was because something like Spirited Gravekeeper can feel really bad. Like if you get a selection that's like Spirited Gravekeeper, Soul Predation, Mino, and Yuna, like you might have a lot of picks where it's just like these mediocre silver cards that honestly aren't too bad, but the quality difference between something like Yuma and Amora's Necromancer versus having something like Barrel plus Winged Serpents on the other side, it gets pretty apparent when you play the quote-unquote high roll version of Abyss versus the ones you see here. And then for golds, Abyss is doing, again, very mediocre. Orthis is very good, but very often Orthis is just like a generic 2-2 because she isn't that great the later the game goes on. Rage of Serpents is like requires you to be lucky with your tempo. Balto is not great. Laura is not great. Screaming and Loathing is usually only good when you have multiple copies because you cycle it and then you like thin your deck out. Ceres is pretty whatever. Mukon is good, but not something you build a deck around. Same thing with Exela, like good for any game. Congregate of Entwining is honestly probably the best thing Abyss has going for it in golds, but without Shamnacha, she is not that insane. And it continues on into legendaries where you have some pretty good legendaries, like with Aragavi, Cerberus, RMV, Medusa, even Charon. But the main thing is just that because legendaries are so few and far between, if you draft a Abyss deck around a strong legendary start, what happens very often is that you're relying on getting these legendaries to begin with to even have a chance in your games. And from what I've noticed so far in playing Take-Two, the key isn't to rely on legendaries. The key is to play a strong base deck and then just hope that your legendaries auto-win you games occasionally at random, which is something that's been helping me out a bit more with getting slightly better at Take-Two. And then last but not least, we have Forest, in my opinion, dead last for Take-Two. You can see it's like pretty much the shortest good gold and silver or bronze and silvers that we have so far. And that's just because Forest doesn't really have many good cards when it comes down to it. Like last set, the reason why Forest was really powerful feeling was because you could have so many rerolls so that you could force like decks like Tempo Fairy. So here, for example, you can see that there's a lot of bronze cards that allow you to play Tempo Fairy and Forest, right? So you can act like, oh hey, like we have so much of the Tempo Fairy list in the bronzes, why don't we play this? It's just because it's only 4 out of like the very large collection of cards, and so you're once again relying on being lucky with what else you draft to lean into the Tempo Fairy archetype. So for example, with Puppet Portal or like with Artifact Portal, it's like the same thing, but Artifact, or rather Portal, can kind of play a lot of different things and it's still a good game plan overall, whereas Tempo Forest is like you need to win in the first 6 turns or you lose. And so the only cards I like picking in this regard are probably going to be cards that are just like very safe to play, but none of these cards are great or going to like be make or break for you in the long-term decks. Like these are just very okay cards, and if you're very good at Forest, I'm sure it's good enough. Like Dion obviously went like 3-2 average at worst with Forest, in my opinion, from what I watched when Take-Two initially came out, but that just requires like a level of Take-Two skill and patience that I don't have. The silvers are honestly a bit better. I should probably have Good Fairy up here just because Good Fairy is a 1-drop that's very efficient to play. Fairy Fencer is very good. Helmet of Unkilling is probably one of the better silvers outside of the really obnoxious ones like in Dragon. And then Supplicant of Unkilling and Aaron can probably just very often straight up win you games because they're so good. But once again, we have a lot of silvers that are either just like very okay / mediocre, if you don't have a real combo played around them, like Lambert Cannon, for example, absurd and Roach, but if you don't have Roach, then really how good is it? Greatwood Warrior is just like a normal 2 or 4/4 that doesn't really do much. Lionel and I guess like Woodwalkers from the previous bronze collection, they're like okay tempo, but they're not really, like you look at Lionel versus Supplicant and you're probably gonna play Supplicant a lot more often because you're probably behind on tempo if you didn't get lucky with your early draw to get like the early quote-unquote tempo Forest curve, in my opinion at least. And of course I think maybe it's just my bias against Forest going to play here. The golds, there are some pretty strong golds. Like obviously Roach is really good. Godwood Staff, if you're able to draft, is really good. Glade and Congregant of Killing are like probably super insane in Take-Two. But there's a lot of golds that could probably feel pretty awkward to play. I guess the benefit with Forest golds is that you can really pick them anytime. But I guess maybe I do have Forest too low. Maybe the gap between Forest and Abyss is like not as much as I thought it was, because these are all definitely playable no matter what card you pick. Like you're never gonna reroll a Forest gold, it looks like, into something else, unlike with Abyss where you have a lot of bad golds. But it's really hard to play around it because like again, Roach you need to like draw into it usually to play it, and then God with Staff you need to have combos. So maybe you know what? I think Forest is probably better than Abyss looking at this now. I think the main reason why Forest would be worse overall is just because the legendaries are a lot worse than Abyss, in my opinion. You trade off the legendary quality for having much better gold quality. Like Amataz is only good if you draft a lot of Fairy Gen early. Titania is just very whatever. Even in Constructed, Cruel is honestly Cruel is good, but like I think in the arena sense, Supplicant, Evangelia, and Cruel are like pretty close, but Cruel is obviously played earlier, so she's more relevant earlier. Arya is only good if you have fairies. Lamaga is honestly quite strong in Take Two. I can see you picking Lamaga plus like Roach or like a Glade for your forest picks if you need the choice. And then Zudia, just get to Azudia. It's easy, no problem. And obviously Rose Queen's whatever. So yeah, that's gonna be my very brief analysis of the cards for Take Two. Again, I'm not the best Take Two player, so if you have disagreements, please let me know, and I'll try my best to learn from your criticisms on it. That'll be all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.